is about to start, so if you can kindly take your seats. And allow me to remind you once again to switch off your cell phone and electronic devices. Welcome back to this second session of our seminar, which is a panel discussion. We'll be listening to presentations about the UNFCCC, UN Convention on Climate Change, and also about the subject of renewable energy policy. And we're very honored to count a very distinguished ambassadors, Delano Bard, and also Mademoiselle Lazare from the different mission of Haiti, and mission permanent representative from the mission of St. Kitts, and also two experts coming especially from Taiwan for this. And I'm proud to introduce Dr. Alistair Edgar, Executive Director of ACONS, to be the moderator of the session.
Thank you. Again, I'll just very briefly introduce our four speakers, and we will go in the order that I have in the program with Ambassador Bart, Mrs. Nazaire, Dr. Chen, and Mr. Lee. So Ambassador Delano Frank Bart is the permanent representative of St. Kitts and Nevis to the United Nations and the UNFCCC COP18, this wonderful UN acronyms that we always have. UNFCCC COP18 Bureau Vice President. Mrs. Astrid Nazaire is Minister Councillor, the Permanent Mission of Haiti to the United Nations. Dr. Chun Sen Chen, Special Representative for Renewable Energy, the Bureau of Energy in the Ministry of Economic Affairs in Taiwan. And Mr. Xinjie Li, Deputy Supervisor, Green Energy and Environment Research Laboratories at the Industrial Technology Research Institute, also in Taiwan. I will ask each to speak for about 15 minutes, and then after that we'll have, again, open question and answer from the floor for our speakers. So, Ambassador Bart, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. May I first of all start by thanking the government of Taiwan and its people for putting together this seminar. And also, as an aside, although in this capacity I'm not speaking for my government, as an aside to thank them for the work that they've been doing with us in the area of renewable energy. I've got just 15 minutes, and it's a very vast topic. And so I'm going to be quite selective as to what I can say within 15 minutes. I basically will begin by a brief background as to the UNFCCC, the convention, and what has flowed from that, and then to indicate, in a sense, some of the work that we have done in that area. I've asked, I'm not sure everyone has had a copy of it, but I've asked that a copy of this particular flowchart be placed on the seats. And it's not for you to study it at this point, but I think it gives you, in essence, a understanding of the tensions in which the different negotiations take place and the different interests that float. Now, I want to begin by saying that you would have picked up I'm not a scientist or an inventor or an entrepreneur, so I'm not going to come to you from the angle of any new technologies. But to say to you in this context, to put in context what I have to say, that apart from the question of cost and the question of attitudes, the question of renewable energies also has these challenges that it faces, includes the issue of geopolitical tensions. In other words, the interest of some countries just does not align with the renewable energies. And so it's against that background that I want to profess and just say what I've got to say. First of all, let's just try and put the whole thing into some kind of context. And if you were to begin with the convention itself, amongst the things that the aim is, there is an aim that we, as it were, there's a determination to protect the climate system for future and for present and future generations. So that's one of the many aims. And then the objective in relation to the convention can be found in Article 2. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. But I find quite often that we enter in discussions and individuals know something about something but not necessarily where to source that information. And so I just want to tell you that in Article 2 of the convention, It sets out, in a sense, clearly the objectives, and the ultimate objective of this convention, and in any related legal instruments that will flow from that, is to, in accordance with the relevant conventions, is for the stabilization of greenhouse gases concentrations in the atmosphere and at a level that will prevent dangerous interference with the climate change. So that's really the background, and that's what we are aiming to achieve as we go along. And so what steps have we had, or how have we gone about it over the years? The first thing, I want to start with the Bali COP, in which the basic idea was to provide the Bali Action Plan, or the Bali Action Plan, sorry, which was a comprehensive process to enable effective and sustainable implementation of the convention through long-term and cooperative action, now and up to last year. And out of that, the plan divided, brought about sort of 5 main categories. One was shared vision, and that had to deal with the question of how you have a long-term vision in relation to goals and emissions, and also in the context of the climate change. And then you had another category of mitigation, which I think speaks for itself, and I'm sure most of us are familiar with what it means. Adaptation, again, the mitigation was really to soften the impact of climate change, and adaptation was to, as it will bring about situations where countries adapt to achieve that, and then technological transfer, and of course, financing. And I think I can say right at the very beginning, the main tensions started essentially with the question of finance. Because at every level that you went, or you got to, there was always the question as to how much it's going to cost. And so you'll have these commitments, as you'll have heard of, and then huge pledges, but no money. And then the next year we come and we have different arguments about it again. And so we moved from that, and then we went to Cancun. And the essence of that agreement was to seek to improve and establish clear goals in relation to mitigation, try and set some time schedules, encourage the participation of all countries in it, and try and review progress towards the 2-degree objective, and a review by 2015 in relation to other objectives. And the professor was right. I think it's Dr. Gerard really pointed out that, in fact, starting in Copenhagen, really, there was that aspect of it, where whilst there was a view that that we should aim for 2 degrees as an objective, in reality, we from the developing country, or the small island states in particular, we actually said we are going to drown at that figure, and we wanted 1.5. Of course, well, the science is out on that, and you know where we stand, so I'm not sure that even though we are taking part in the process, that we are doing ourselves much good if we don't get down to 1.5. But yes, we have to be part of it. And then there was the question of the transparency of action, ensure international transparency, and of course finance, mobilize, in terms of transparency, to mobilize development and transfer of clean technology to the different areas. And then, as I said, finance, mobilize, and upscale the contributions. And then there was the setting up of which was essentially an important landmark, the setting up of the Green Climate Fund, which was to disburse 100 billion per year by 2020. But up to now, there isn't any money forthcoming in relation to that. So again, we have more difficulties there. Another objective was to assist in the adaptation policies, as we discussed before, protect, and then forests became a center of focus. And so we ended up with issues and plans to address the forest, the REDS plus issue, the adaptation there. And then we had the capacity building, how you try and upscale and overcome the challenges. So that was what came out of Cancun. And then out of Durban, we then had the roadmap for implementation. We had arguments about the need to address the second commitment period also at that one recognized the need for new platforms for negotiations, and so those were established. And then a conclusion which was based on some rather broad-based negotiation categories. And then there was also something that started to emerge in that thing, the need to increase the ambitions, a greater increase in ambitions. And that came about really because when you took stock of it, the issue, it soon became clear that whatever countries had committed to was not enough. And so there was a need to try and cause the, to increase the question of how much you commit and upscaling the ambitions. And then we came to Doha, and to a large extent, a lot of it continued to be trying to emphasize, trying to increase some things which had already been done, and pointing out to a large extent the failures of those who have made commitments to comply with their obligations. Now my role, just before I go on to the the last conference which I've just come back from, I just want my role throughout last year was essentially to address the question of the elections to the different bodies of the that have been created under the convention. But it was interesting to see the politics in relation to how you ended up with positions. Some countries were not interested in certain seats, others were, and you can certainly get a sense of where the interest lies. And of course, if you go back to that chart which I handed you, you will see to some extent, it's not, I don't think everyone has had it, but certainly you can try and ensure that you've got a copy of it when you, because it really does help you to understand why, it's not an excuse, but why we're not getting very far at times, because the conflict in interest. Take, for instance, the G77, which is the widest and the biggest group, that actually, if you look at it and when you have a chance, you will see that even in that group, there's so many subsectors. The G77 plus China, of course, is one of the most important groups within the arrangements, but also in addition, in terms of the UN structure. And it's, although it's G77, it's about 136 countries that are all members of it. And the end result is that you do have such diverse groups, for instance, as the OPEC group. And then you have the basic group, Brazil, India, China, and South Africa. You have the emerging countries which are coming. And so you could understand why it's extremely difficult, even within the context of the G77, at times to come to some conclusion. And then you have other groups which are not part of it, but at the end of the day, they are the ones who have the money. And you know, sometimes you get resolutions or you get agreements, but if there isn't any money to support it, it's essentially a Pyrrhic victory, and you have to go back again to the drawing board. And so, this last conference is very interesting over the period of those that have attended. You find that decisions are literally made on the last night or on the last occasion. And it really drags on and on and on, for one reason really, that there's a recognition within the bodies, within the conference, that the world is looking on. But at the same time, they're not willing to give. And so you find, for instance, we should have finished on Friday night, but it was basically Sunday morning that we actually had an agreement of some sort, because there were wranglings about what words should be used and what shouldn't be used. And so what I would say in terms of the final analysis of what came out of the Warsaw Conference is that it attempted, there's some attempt, it is felt, that we have secured a kind of pathway to 2015 in Paris. Next year is Lima, the year after is Paris. But what's crucial is that we should have some legally binding agreement which will help to put structures in place. Now, I don't know how strong it's going to be quite frank, because when you listen to Professor Gerard, I think he makes the point quite well, that at the end of the day, although he doesn't say it quite this way, I hope, at the end of the day, you need a strong instrument by which you can do something, and it's no point just always have an advisory capacities from institutions, of course. So I'm not sure it's going to be a legally binding agreement, but what are we going to be bound to, and how you're going to enforce it again with the issues that we will have to take on board. So that's one of the things we are hoping to get out of that, and would be a end result success of that aspect of it. And then there is also the emissions goal to come into force by 2020. And now that one also, there was quite a lot of debate and argument about it, because what it was set in a national level, as to each country would set its own national level. But of course, there were questions as to how transparent and how honest you will be, and how much will you be able to be committed to it. And so that took the better part of a week within that particular grouping. That took the better part of a week to be discussed and analyzed. And then you had certain countries, in particular some of the countries, who felt that it's no point giving me forcing me to commit to a higher level if I don't have the financial capacity to deliver at that point. And so we ended up with a disagreement and a long debate as to whether there should be contributions or commitments or contributions, whether countries should make contributions or commitments in relation to their national goals. And the end result is that what has come out of it is that, well, at least you can, but the whole process hopefully will be subjected to some peer review, scrutiny, which will see whether or not they are fair and sufficiently ambitious for the process within it. And then you also had some issues which arose out of the approach of the developing countries, the approach by the developing countries and the developed countries. The like-minded development group, which isn't actually specifically identified in the ring, but there's an asterisk which points to it, to the groups if you go through the chart. And the debate there was that they were of the view that under the KP protocol, essentially they wanted to maintain the position that the question of emission reduction was largely the responsibility of the developed countries, and so the developing countries have no responsibilities in relation to that, because they said that came out of the 1992 talks. Of course, you would look and you would see that among those countries were Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Bolivia, and Malaysia, countries which have oil and large deposits of coal, and so you could see why they were seeking to try and maintain that position. But at the end of the day, that was rejected, and again, that was also rejected by the countries who also have, the developed countries who also had a vested interest in trying to protect their position as well. And then there was a lot of debate on another area, which is loss and damage. I think one of the speakers made reference to it before. This was, to a large extent, many of you here who are lawyers would recognize it as a means of compensation. Normally you attribute it to blame or to connect it to liability by specific, the source of that would be required to make a compensation. However, that went on for a long time, and the end result was that it was agreed that this would be something which would come into force. There would be a Warsaw International mechanism by which those who were victims of disaster would receive aid